very much, Mr. Speaker. I think we've had some discussion between House leadership on either side of the House about a motion involving some recent developments around the Energy East pipeline proposal by TransCanada. Mr. Speaker, the recent developments I mentioned is the joint press conference held by the Premier of Ontario and the Premier of Quebec regarding this proposed pipeline. Mr. Speaker, among the requirements now being requested by Ontario and Quebec in terms of the process, in terms of what might be their official and more informal standing in the process, is included Ontario requesting a separate environmental review for that particular province for the pipeline. Also, Quebec wanting the licensing assessment to include upstream GHG emissions, and so our understanding is that this is part of their joint position as well. Mr. Speaker, these two issues are a bit of a concern. A number of other requests they've made around the process, around a consultation that's required with First Nations, with communities along the pipeline, environmental assessment, safety assessment. These are completely reasonable requests on the part of the people of Ontario and Quebec. The pipeline will certainly go through those provinces, and we think that these answers to these very reasonable questions will come in the National Energy Board process that actually deals with this very specific issue. I've welcomed in the past the Leader of the Opposition's comments that what was good enough for our provincial NDP here was this sort of the triple net process that NEB provides for assessment of these kinds of projects. We would say to our counterparts, our friends in Ontario and Quebec, let that National Energy Board process occur, because they will have answers to all of those reasonable questions. The request for separate environmental reviews in any particular jurisdiction is a concern, however, and the request for some sort of upstream GHG evaluation of the pipeline is of deep and abiding concern. It should be to all members of this House. It should be to the people of the province of Saskatchewan. It should be a concern to Albertans. It should be a concern to all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, ostensibly what is being requested here, I think, from our friends in Ontario and Quebec is that this pipeline, its approval should at least contemplate some sort of an evaluation of the greenhouse gases related to the pipeline. What's unclear in terms of this ask is whether or not they're referencing just what will be conveyed in the pipeline or the pipeline itself, because there's going to be a CO2 footprint that went into the manufacture of the steel for the pipeline, and all the construction process will certainly have its own footprint. And so if it's truly a life cycle of the oil and also of the pipeline and all the work, you're going to have a very significantly higher number on the GHGs than you would if you just narrowed it to any one of those things. The problem is that nobody really knows. The problem is the precedent that this would set for other projects across the country would also carry this feature of no one really being familiar with what is being required of governments. How will any project get done like this in the future? How will we ensure the transportation of other goods and services if this somehow becomes a precedent in other provincial capitals? Because what we see here is a bit of a pattern, Mr. Speaker, where provincial capitals are bringing to bear what seems to be some, not contrivances, but some previous, heretofore unimplemented ideas around assessment of these particular projects, measures that have never been requested of these particular projects. And I think that should concern us all. We should begin this debate, Mr. Speaker, in the House with a summary of what the Energy East pipeline is and what it is not. It has been described by some as the ultimate recycling program. Why would it be described in this way, Mr. Speaker? Well, 2/3 of the pipeline exists already. It will not have to be constructed anew. It exists already, and it is carrying, for the most part, it's carrying natural gas. It's a gas pipeline. About 1/3 of the total pipeline will be constructed. When it is complete, it'll carry 1.1 million barrels of a variety of petroleum products. And I talked to TransCanada yesterday. I mean, at the beginning of the projects, we're talking about conventional oil. In the case of Saskatchewan's contribution to the pipeline, it'll be light sweet crude from the Bakken. In fact, it doesn't get much lighter or much sweeter than the crude we have in southeast Saskatchewan. So let's make that very clear, because those who are opposing this in other parts of the country, by the way, NGOs especially, they're trying to paint this as somehow directly related to the oil sands. It's true that a diluted bitumen may form a part of the oil in the pipeline, but at the beginning, at the outset, and for the most part, we're talking about conventional oil. Conventional oil that will head to to Eastern Canada. So that's the first point, Mr. Speaker, for the NGOs that are opposing it. We're not talking about the oil sands. We happen to think responsible development of the oil sands, by the way, is fine. We don't have a problem with that on this side of the House. We have about 10,000 square kilometres of potential oil sands in Saskatchewan, and the previous NDP even set up a regime and for a royalty regime for that. We hope one day that it's possible to develop that resource in a sustainable way and in concert with the area of First Nations that are in that part of northwestern Saskatchewan. But some in Canada certainly have real concerns about oil sands. So let's be clear, we're not talking about oil sands, oil in the pipeline. We're talking about conventional oil. This is perhaps the most important point in the debate. The oil in the pipeline from Saskatchewan and from Alberta will replace oil that's currently imported into Eastern Canada from Iraq, from Algeria, from Venezuela, where, by the way, the GHG footprint around that oil is very significant. Venezuelan oil comes at some GHG cost that you wouldn't find in the Bakken, for example. Never mind the transportation CO2 that comes with shipping that oil to Atlantic Canada. It would also replace oil currently imported to Canada from Saudi Arabia and the United States of America. And I think most people in the country, whether they live in Montreal or Swift Current, Saskatchewan, might be surprised to find out that a big part of our country imports oil from places like Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Iraq, Venezuela, the United States of America. That just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because I think they also understand that this country is a world leader in the production of oil. We have the third largest known proven reserves of oil on the face of the earth, and are an exporter of oil. Why would that country, why would large parts of that country, communities of some size, industries of some size, rely on oil from Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Algeria and Venezuela and the United States to consume or to refine? It just doesn't make any sense, Mr. Speaker, but that's what's happening today, and it's been like that for a very long time in Canada. The Energy East pipeline seeks to stop that. The Energy East pipeline would bring Western Canadian oil to Eastern Canada so that we no longer need to import oil. I don't know how you can be opposed to that. I don't know how you could want to put up more barriers to that, as we seem to see coming from the capitals of Quebec City and Queen's Park. This is a very positive development. By the way, it's why New Brunswick's premier, and the new premier there, is very much in favour of the pipeline. It's why, to his credit, Thomas Mulcair, the leader of the Democratic Party and the leader of the opposition, is in favour also of the Energy East pipeline. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the replacement of foreign oil, I think there's one other point I'd like to make. I've seen some comments on social media that need to be challenged, and we need to clear these up on the record. Some have somehow introduced parts of the Gateway pipeline debate into this particular debate, and specifically the part they tried to introduce is around tankers, oil tankers. They're trying to raise the spectre of now oil tankers off the East Coast because of the Energy East pipeline bringing oil to that part of our country. And it's true that a lot of it will be refined for consumption in Atlantic Canada, creating value-added jobs here in the country, by the way, for our oil. Some of it might find its way to export. And so I've seen some trying to paint this picture that, well, now we're going to have tankers off the coast that we otherwise wouldn't have. Really, Mr. Speaker? And where do these folks think the oil from Iraq, the oil from Iraq and Venezuela and Algeria, how it got here in the first place? It wasn't an oil ferry. It was tankers, Mr. Speaker. Tankers that are in the sea today. Arguably, you could make the case that if we are displacing the oil that they both refine and consume in Atlantic Canada, we should see a reduction in the tanker traffic. You could also make the case that if we are replacing oil in Atlantic Canada, if we're displacing oil from Venezuela, the GHG footprint is likely less than it should be. But, Mr. Speaker, I actually hesitate to get into that whole argument, because GHG assessment should have nothing to do with approval for this pipeline. And we encourage the federal government to go ahead with a very rigorous process that's in place. A process, Mr. Speaker, that has already resulted in TransCanada, in the earliest stages of their effort to get approval, having already contacted 5,500 landowners, having already had consultations with 155 First Nations and Métis communities, and I think they've signed 55 agreements already with First Nations. The process is underway. The National Energy Board process is underway. And it will ask questions around safety, and it will ask questions around environmental concerns, and it will engage the communities. It already is engaging communities who need to be consulted on this particular proposal. In fact, as a result of the assessment process, $2.5 million will be provided for those who wish to make submissions but can't afford the costs of making a submission. So all who want to make a case to the NEB about the pipeline, good, bad, or indifferent, I believe are going to have the chance, and they'll be supported financially in doing this. Mr. Speaker, I've also heard people raise some sort of specter of danger around pipeline transportation of oil, not just the environmental piece, but danger. Mr. Speaker, here again, let's get some facts on the record. We don't have this pipeline currently in effect, obviously. That's why we're having this debate. And yet oil from Saskatchewan and Alberta is moving to Ontario and Quebec and points east, not to the degree we need to, not to the degree we could displace the need for foreign oil, but it is. How is it moving, Mr. Speaker? Well, it's moving in part by rail. Mr. Speaker, we know that with respect to the rail transport of oil, there are significant risks. In fact, we have seen those risks manifest themselves in an unspeakable tragedy in the province of Quebec. The risks, by the way, Mr. Speaker, as you will know, you're from southeast Saskatchewan, increase with respect to the nature of the oil that those rail cars are carrying. The lighter the oil, the sweeter the oil, the more incendiary the oil. And the risks increase. What we're proposing here in Saskatchewan and in Alberta and in New Brunswick and across the country to our friends in Ontario and to our friends in Quebec is, let's displace foreign oil, let's do that. Let's add value to the oil at home. Let's perhaps reduce the extra cost of oil to Atlantic Canadians who are paying the Brent price, not the West Texas price. And let's make sure that as much oil is moving in, not the perfect method, but the safest method we know to move oil, which is in a pipeline, rather than perhaps in a truck or on a rail. We know that's just simply not as safe. These are the basics of an argument that I have to admit, Mr. Speaker, I knew that Gateway has been in trouble for some time as a potential pipeline. Keystone's been in trouble for some time. As we know, that it's an intractable problem, it seems, and an interminable debate that's going on. I honestly, Mr. Speaker, did not believe that Energy East would be in jeopardy, for the reasons we've talked about, for the multi-partisan support that exists for it. Liberals, New Democrats, federally Conservatives, provincially here, Saskatchewan Party, provincially in Alberta, Progressive Conservatives, Wild Rose. I mean, I didn't anticipate this concern, but I'm worried now. And that's why we've asked for this motion to be debated. That's why we've asked this legislature to send the signal to our friends in Ontario and Quebec. Learn the facts of this pipeline. Understand the environmental, frankly, the reduction of environmental risk that comes with the pipeline if you're not moving it by rail car. Understand that we want for this country to be energy independent, that we want for this country to not need oil from Algeria or Iraq, Mr. Speaker, or Venezuela, or Saudi Arabia. This just makes a lot of common sense. And Mr. Speaker, we are hopeful to have a unanimous support, not just for the motion that's before us, which I'll read right now, Mr. Speaker, but also for a change we might even want to do to the motion to make sure we characterize the GHG part of their assessment for what it is, which is unnecessary and, frankly, Mr. Speaker, unworkable, because the precedent that it sets, maybe for Quebec Steel coming this way, doesn't make a lot of sense, won't be good for the country in terms of internal trade, and it needs not to be a part of what Ontario and Quebec are discussing, Mr. Speaker. And so I'm going to move at this time that this Assembly supports the Energy East pipeline and the massive economic activity and benefits it will bring to all regions of Canada, which include significant economic growth, tax revenue growth, and job creation in Ontario and Quebec. I so move.